light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. I often hear people talk about looking at a problem and, quote, needing a new perspective. When you begin to deconstruct what's involved in a perspective, however, it's quite a bit more difficult, I think, than what these sorts of conversations, to change one's perspective at any depth, shall we say. When someone says, well, here's my perspective, here's your perspective, and we talk about a complex subject or topic, and it kind of oversimplifies each person's perspective. But I'm not trying to address this perspective in comparison to that one on any particular topic within this. I want to go a level deeper and say, what is really involved in truly changing one's perspective? To simply integrate somebody else's comments may help me to make a different decision, and I can say thank you for sharing the benefit of your perspective, but there's still more. In considering why I have the perspective I do, I would first have to notice the actual experiences I had had of anything of which that person or thing reminds me. If we need a concrete example. If we were discussing racism, and it could be any races, it could be people from two different towns of the same race. Okay, if, for example, we have one child who grows up in a small town and one child who grows up in the country. It's very close to the two kinds of experiences that I grew up with, except that we didn't move to town till I was 14, but we weren't actually on a farm because my father worked for the Postal Service. And so, but there were farms all around us, so if we ever wanted to earn a little extra money for candy or whatever, we would have to go to the neighbors and find out whether they needed any help on their farms. And so there were times where I helped the neighbors with milking or with moving hay bales or whatever. It was a very different perspective because it was particular experiences, but it also had traditions and history. The reason that some people were there and were farmers and used the methods they did was because that's what their elders had done, and it was essentially handed down from father to son for many generations. It would be almost rebellious then, but not necessarily a bad idea at some point, for a son to say, this is the way we've done it for 3 generations, I'm going to do it this way because I have been reading some articles in this farm magazine that are detailing new methods of farming and why they're preferable and how they prevent some of the problems that we've been struggling with for generations. Whether it's erosion in the fields, and so now we're doing contour plowing, or whether it's a different type of crop, whether you switch from corns to soybeans because of the effect it has on the soil, different strains of alfalfa, all sorts of different things that could shift farming methods as people learn better ways of doing what has been done a particular way for generations. We don't need to get all judgmental about the people who came before. They did the best they could, but they didn't have access to the education or the knowledge that we have access to now. So without wasting time on judgment and blame, we simply, the real important thing is get down to the business of using the new method. When a problem occurs, it's not as important whose fault the problem is as how do we fix the problem and how do we act in a way that prevents the problem from recurring. for me to change my perspective, talking with someone who grew up in town and having them describe about having a backyard that was only this big instead of having 3 acres to play on. And if, because my family didn't get along very well in terms of any depth of communication or relationship, in 3 acres, it was very easy to be apart from each other. And if somebody didn't understand and you just needed a timeout, I could go out in the field and sit on the rock pile underneath the sumac bushes and see no one, talk to no one, deal with no one for 2 or 3 hours. If I didn't show up for supper, I suppose my parents might worry, but then even that was not exactly a standard in the household in which I grew up. For me to expect anyone else to have my perspective, though, who did not have my experiences, would be unreasonable. For me to expect a young child who grew up within a Protestant Christian denomination to understand what it is to go to Catholic school is not a reasonable expectation. But to say it's this or it's that, as if you could sum the whole thing up in 1 or 2 things, would be pointless. You can't. It was a multi-faceted experience that involved, in my case, involved nuns who no longer wore their ritual garments. They were dressed like everyone else, and yet we understood they were nuns. They weren't women, they were nuns. And there were priests who dressed differently, and some of them smoked cigars and played golf, but they were priests, they weren't men. And so there was men and women and priests and nuns as if there were 4 genders and 2 of them were non-sexual. That's a very different understanding of the parameters and structure of life than that which Protestant friends that I met in junior high and high school grew up with. They didn't have as broad of a frame of reference. I had 4 genders, they only had 2. Now, of course, in this day and age, where there is less surgical intervention, we are now also finding that there are numerous people that are somewhere in between all the rest. That there's male, there's female, and there's what's now called intersexuals. People who have combinations of gender characteristics that don't fall within the traditional categories. And where in the past they would have been surgically altered at birth to fit into one or the other category, as if that was absolutely essential, it's my understanding this is not being done as much anymore, and they're being allowed to grow up and make their own choices and live their own lives and be whatever kind of anomaly they want to be. A whole nother realm in addition to that, of course, is the phenomenon of transgender people. I can hear their stories. I can study their societal context, whether they grew up in a town or a city or a particular country, whether the United States or England or wherever, or Scandinavia. I can collect all the information, and still it will not give me the perspective of being that person, of having the entire world treat me a certain way that may or may not have felt correct at the time. It is good to listen and to have dialogue. It is not good to presume that you have ever accomplished the full understanding, that there is not even more yet to learn, that growing up as black or female or Native American or Chinese or Japanese or South American, or Latin American, any number of different categories. These are all categories, and the thing I keep saying about categories is that there is no individual who is the embodiment of a category. But the categories were created for conversation around things that seem to be fairly common within a particular people group. But then for each individual within that group, it offers the challenge, if you will, of figuring out how much commonality and how much difference you have with your own category. When I was in graduate school, I heard all these broad, horrific statements about racism, about how bad white people were and how persecuted black people were, and I'm not denying any of that, but when I finally asked somebody, what is a white person? And they rattled off a 5-minute long definition and got to the end, and I shrugged and I said, there is not one thing you've mentioned that has any commonality with my life experience. Everything you've said white people are, I'm not. So what am I? And so anymore, when they hand me questionnaires and things and say identify your race, I check others, because I don't fit any of the definitions I've heard for what white people or Native Americans or European immigrants or whatever it is. All the categories describe something, and I listen to the description and I look in the mirror and I say, it's not me. I don't know who you're talking about, but it's not me. I guess what I'm reaching for in discussing how difficult it is to change one's perspective is more compassion and understanding, more acceptance that most of the time we really don't understand. And even if we have heard someone similar talk about their experience, we have to be very, very careful about projecting those qualities onto this person. If someone had talked to Harvey Milk about what it means to be gay, and then brought all those descriptions and said, okay, you're gay, that means that you are this, and you are this, and you are this, and you've experienced this. And I would say, well, wait a minute, I experienced some of that, but not all of it, and not in the way that Harvey did. And from one generation to the next, of course, it keeps changing. Those who experience the phenomena of the AIDS epidemic during the 1980s have one perspective, and those who didn't come along into their teenage years until after the year 2000 have a very different perception of the whole realm. And for some of them with whom I've spoken, it's difficult to understand the early 1980s of being afraid to even touch each other, because nobody knew how it was spread or what it was or why so many gay men, hundreds of thousands of gay men were dying so quickly. It was just devastating, and the way that society turned a blind eye to it all, so much so that that was how the organization ACT UP was created, because it was legitimately an outrageous situation that hundreds of thousands of people were dying, and everybody basically stood up and said, we don't care, or we think it's God's judgment on you. And I really, as an interfaith minister, I have a real strong argument against assigning to God the sort of narrow-mindedness that can really only be found within humanity. The narrow-mindedness and the demands and the expectations and the judgmental attitudes that humanity puts on each other, I don't know of another species on Earth that does that. It's clearly we've got our work cut out for ourselves to move beyond that. But that's where, in one sense, it's important to reach for an alternative perspective, because there's something about inclusivity that makes all of us better people, that makes humanity a better species, that makes the solutions we devise and the methods we devise far, far more effective by integrating all these diverse perspectives. And we have to use communication and dialogue to do that. It doesn't happen automatically. One of the major pitfalls to that, though, is slipping into presumptuousness, that because I met a gay man over here, I know how this gay man will act. Well, actually you don't. And because I met and discussed what it is to be a woman with this person, I know how to treat that woman over there. Well, actually you don't. It still has to come back to the basic point of dialogue, of saying, how do you self-identify? Who are you? And how much commonality or distinction do you have with the categories that people may be inclined to project onto you? I met a young man once who seemed to be very Latino, and he said he was very frustrated because people kept coming up to him expecting, speaking Spanish and expecting him to respond. And he had to basically shrug and tell them, I don't know Spanish, I'm from Guatemala. And, it's a completely different language. Judging by appearances it's better phrased with a question. Let's put it that way. It's not that we come in and say, well, you're obviously this, so I can ask you that. Instead, to say, you look like a Latino person I met a year ago. Do you happen to be Latino also? And they may say, no, I'm not. And I hope they won't be offended by the comparison, because certainly there's nothing in what I said that would express an intention to be offensive, but I was just trying to find out if there was any commonality with the person I dealt with before. But there's no reason to think that there would be. They're two completely different people. Even within a all-white Southern Baptist congregation, it is not difficult to find people who can argue about any number of things. They may go to the same church, they may have close to the same skin color, they may live in the same town, they may even shop at the same grocery store. And still, there are so many things about which they could argue. To try to take on someone else's perspective so that you could understand them better, interact with them better, and so forth, it's ultimately not that we're trying to take on their perspective, it's that we're trying to understand how they see the world and therefore what they need from the world around them. I saw a picture recently of that was in a transgender forum of sorts. I don't remember even exactly what was in the photo, but it was basically trying to present this notion that to understand what it is to, I guess to use one explanation, to have been born in the wrong body may be extremely difficult. But the thing I answered to that discussion is that I don't have to understand your experience in order to treat you with respect. I don't have to know your perspective to know that you should, well, according to my belief anyway, you should have your own voice. You should be able to make your own choices. You should have the same civil rights as everybody else. You should be able to marry who you love. You should be able to live in peace and not worry about being burglarized or murdered or assaulted. These are very basic societal tenets that allow people to live in harmony and peace without annihilating each other. I would suggest that humanity is on a collision course, some people would say we're already there, with becoming a global community. Within a global community, there are hundreds, if not millions, of diverse perspectives. We need to be able to respect each other in order to get along and not annihilate each other, not cause more problems for each other and have others causing more problems for ourselves. But that requires respect, not a comprehensive and complete understanding of somebody else's perspective. That respect can be supported, however, by hearing somebody else's story, by taking the time to listen before you speak, by taking the time to seriously consider what that person's challenges are. I, for example, have never known a woman who is paid less than a man for doing her job. Or if I did know such a person, she never mentioned it, so I when I hear these stories of women being paid less than men, I always wonder if it's a phenomena mostly associated with some other region of the United States or with larger cities or with particular professions. If the companies with which I was familiar in the past were in fact paying women less than men, I'm not sure how we'd find that out, because every single one of them always said you're not allowed to talk about your wages with anyone else. Did we or did we not? Well, most of the time I was too busy getting through my own life to worry about what someone else is being paid. But if anyone had ever mentioned that, by the way, do you realize they're being paid less than you, I would immediately say, well, that's absolutely not right. It raises the question, I guess, if talking about what you're paid could cost you your job, who's going to do it? And that kind of secrecy basically makes it impossible for the unbalanced situation to be addressed, and for men to ever really respect and appreciate and integrate a woman's perspective. The attempt, I suppose, to get at that might be the minimum wage laws, in which we basically said everyone has to make at least this much. But the problem we're running into in the current age now is that the minimum wage is not a living wage. There is literally nowhere left in the United States where you can be anything more than homeless on a minimum wage of 40 hours a week. So people are working long hours, and it's essentially becoming the modern day slavery, because it is so entrenched in and so orchestrated around, yes, but what do you need? And if you need this, you will only get it if you do this. And it's too much. It's not respecting the person as they deserve to be respected, regardless of gender orientation or race or anything else. Every single person who is born has their own unique perspective, and may throughout their lives attempt to respect and integrate other people's perspectives. And I think it's good when we make an attempt. It's not that we shouldn't try, but there is never a justification for smugly proclaiming that you have accomplished an understanding, that you have solved the riddle, that you have come up with the answer that will work for everyone. Well, it's an answer that will work for some, probably an answer that should be tried and implemented as however well it can, but nothing is the final answer, and nothing is the final perspective. There's no last person to look at anything, assuming that thing is going to be around for future generations. And even if we're talking about, I don't know, something like cursive writing or something. I mean, there are archaeological records and computer records and museum records rather, and library records where we can look back at ancient things, and someday somebody will be looking back at us as we being the ancient things. And I wonder what conclusions they will draw based on what we've left behind. The quirk of the current time, I guess, is that we're becoming so dependent upon computers that the records are becoming electronic, and it's actually much, much easier to destroy electronic records than it is printed ones. And so we may get to a point where, because of computers, people have forgotten how to write, people have forgotten how to read, there are no printed records, somebody sets off the mother of all magnetic pulses, and all of the electronic information is wiped from human memory. And we're back having to reinvent everything all over again. But it does take in every thought we think, every word we speak, the way we choose our words that we speak, the familiar relationships, the national context, the temporal context, whether we lived in the 18th century or the 21st century. All of that changes perspective and changes ultimately changes understanding. And if we don't have the understanding, then it makes that much more difficult to have any language. And we find ourselves increasingly isolated. It's kind of a bizarre paradox, I guess, when you think about it, that in one sense we feel less isolated by language and by considering things from other people's perspective, and yet at the same time we have to approach with humility, because there will never be an end to learning and understanding the other person's perspective. There's just so many subtle wrinkles alter the whole playing field, if you will. And consequently, each time you meet someone, you could walk away from that conversation knowing just a little bit more. In any case, I hope my comments during the last half hour have been helpful to you. Thank you very much for watching.